What if the most consequential backchannel in modern geopolitical history has been hiding in plain sight, operating right now between two men whose regimes publicly claim they have nothing to say to each other? Think about what that actually means. On one side, you have Donald Trump, a man who launched a military operation against Iran, codenamed Epic Fury, on February 28, 2026. On the other side, you have Mojtaba Khamenei, a man whose very existence is wrapped in mystery, a man who hasn't appeared in public since his father and the entire senior Iranian leadership were wiped out in American and Israeli strikes, a man whose location is so secretive that the CIA and Mossad are actively searching for him, and a man whose own father reportedly believed he was not very bright and unfit to lead. And yet, according to a bombshell report now circulating across Israeli intelligence circles, diplomatic newsrooms, and backrooms in Islamabad and Ankara, these two men, or at least their direct representatives, have been talking, quietly, carefully, and with the fate of the global oil supply, the Strait of Hormuz, the Middle East power map, and potentially the entire nuclear architecture of our world hanging in the balance. Iran publicly denies everything. Trump publicly confirms some things while strategically obscuring others, refusing to name his Iranian counterpart because, as he put it himself, he doesn't want that person to be killed. And right there, in that one sentence alone, you get the full picture of how lethal, how real, and how urgent this secret channel actually is. Now let's slow down and really understand what is happening here, because I think most of the coverage you're seeing is missing the deeper architecture of this moment. And when you miss the architecture, you miss the meaning. So let me walk you through this carefully, because the implications of this back-channel story, if it is what it appears to be, reach far beyond Iran and the United States. They touch Russia, China, Israel, global energy markets, the future of nuclear non-proliferation, and the very question of who actually controls power in a state that has just had its entire leadership decapitated by military force. Let's start with the fundamentals of what we actually know as of late March 2026. On February 28, 2026, a US-Israeli military operation began, and in the strikes that followed, Iran's supreme leader Ayatollah Ali Khamenei was killed, along with a host of other senior Iranian leaders, including Mojtaba Khamenei's wife's father, the prominent conservative politician Gholam Ali Haddad. That is not a footnote, that is a civilizational rupture inside the Iranian state. In the span of a single military campaign, the Islamic Republic lost a man who had guided its ideology for decades, along with layer after layer of its senior military and political command structure. As Axios reported, Israeli officials now describe Iran's top leaders as operating like wanted people, moving between safe houses and avoiding digital communications entirely. That is the environment inside which Mojtaba Khamenei, a 56-year-old man with no real diplomatic experience and a reputation for operating in the shadows of his father's power, suddenly found himself elevated to supreme leader. And here is the first thing to understand that most people are not saying clearly enough. Intelligence agencies, including the CIA and Mossad, have no solid evidence that Mojtaba is actually giving orders. A senior Israeli official told Axios directly, "We have no evidence that he is really the one giving orders. It's beyond weird." We don't think the Iranians would have gone through all this trouble to choose a dead guy as the supreme leader, but at the same time, we have no proof that he is taking the helm. Read that again. The man who is Iran's supreme leader, the man whose blessing is apparently being invoked to authorize peace negotiations with the United States, may or may not be alive, may or may not be in Russia receiving medical treatment, and may or may not have ever personally read the public statements attributed to him. This is not a normal geopolitical situation. This is something we have genuinely never seen before in the post-World War II era. Now, what about this secret channel? According to the Israeli newspaper Ynet, last week, Iranian Foreign Minister Abbas Araghchi and American mediator Steve Witkoff had a direct telephone conversation, which also included Jared Kushner. It was in this conversation that the Iranian side made clear that Mojtaba Khamenei had already taken his father's place and authorized the movement toward an agreement, with Araghchi conveying, "We have received his consent and blessing." Now pause on that sentence. The Iranian foreign minister is telling Trump's two most senior diplomatic operators that the new supreme leader, a man no one can locate, a man whom US intelligence says may be in Moscow receiving emergency medical treatment, has given his blessing to close this war. That is an extraordinary claim, and the fact that it was kept so secret that even within Trump's own administration only a small handful of people knew about it while Israel found out about the channel's existence only by accident, tells you everything about the delicacy of this moment and the enormous stakes surrounding it. What do the Iranians want from this? That is the question that cuts through all the noise. Iran's foreign ministry acknowledged receiving messages from the United States through friendly states, requesting negotiations, and indicated that appropriate responses had been given according to the country's fundamental positions. That careful language, fundamental positions, is doing enormous diplomatic work, because Iran's fundamental positions have always included the right to enrich uranium, the removal of all US sanctions, and no normalization with Israel. A senior Iranian lawmaker warned that there would be no negotiations with the United States and cautioned that Iran could further escalate pressure in energy markets. So publicly, Iran is playing hardball. Privately, its foreign minister is apparently telling Witkoff and Kushner that the supreme leader has blessed a deal. That gap between the public posture and the private signal is not confusion. That is Iranian statecraft, and it is operating exactly as it has for decades. On the American side, the diplomatic architecture involves Pakistan, Turkey, Egypt, and Oman, all simultaneously passing messages between Washington and Tehran. Pakistan's intelligence chief, Lieutenant General Asim Malik, is personally engaging with Witkoff and Kushner, while Turkish Foreign Minister Hakan Fidan has been in rapid-fire contact with both the Iranian Foreign Minister and his American counterpart. Think about the geography of that coalition for a moment. You have a NATO member, Turkey, actively mediating between the United States and Iran in the middle of an active military conflict. You have Pakistan, a nuclear-armed Islamic republic with deep historical ties to both Washington and the Muslim world, serving as the primary conduit. And you have Egypt, the largest Arab state, trying to pull these threads together into something coherent. This is not improvised. This is a diplomatic architecture that takes weeks to construct, which means the groundwork for these talks was being laid even as the bombs were falling. Now let's talk about the man Trump is actually dealing with inside Iran, because this is where the story gets genuinely complicated. US envoys Steve Witkoff and Jared Kushner have been in contact with the Speaker of the Iranian Parliament, Mohammad Bagher Ghalibaf, who is believed to be representing Tehran in the negotiations. Ghalibaf is a former general in the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps, a former mayor of Tehran, and a close associate of Mojtaba Khamenei, and he played a key role in managing Iran's war effort. Ghalibaf publicly denied that any negotiations were taking place, calling American claims an effort to manipulate markets. But here is what you need to understand about that denial. In Iranian political culture, a public denial of talks is often a prerequisite for the talks to continue. If Ghalibaf publicly acknowledged he was speaking with Kushner and Witkoff, hardliners inside the IRGC would immediately call it treason, so the denial is protective. It is not necessarily honest, and it is certainly not the full story. Trump himself has said his team is not working with Mojtaba Khamenei directly, but he has declined to reveal the identity of the top person his team has allegedly been speaking to, saying explicitly that he does not want that person to be killed. That is a stunning admission when you sit with it for a moment. The President of the United States, in public, is acknowledging that his Iranian diplomatic interlocutor is so exposed, so vulnerable, so aware of the target on their back, that revealing their name could get them assassinated. That tells you exactly how fragile the Iranian state is right now, and it tells you something else that is even more important. It tells you that somewhere inside Iran's destroyed power structure, there are people who genuinely want out of this war and who are terrified that being seen to want out will cost them their lives. When asked what Washington was seeking in these negotiations, Trump outlined 3 core demands: no nuclear bomb, no nuclear weapon, not even close, low-key on missiles, and peace in the Middle East. Those are the public demands. But what is on the Iranian side of the ledger? Iran has several things it needs from any deal. It needs sanctions relief. It needs its frozen assets unfrozen. It needs some guarantee of regime survival, or at minimum the survival of whatever structure replaces the old regime. It needs the Strait of Hormuz situation resolved without appearing to capitulate under military pressure. And it needs to save enough face domestically that whoever signs this deal does not immediately become a target for the hardliners within the IRGC who still believe Iran can win this confrontation through attrition. Meanwhile, the IRGC itself appears to be consolidating its own power. Senior Arab officials have told Axios that the IRGC is effectively running Iran now, and that they are highly ideological and ready to die. This is the contradiction at the heart of the entire situation. The diplomatic track running through Arachi and Ghalibaf and the various regional mediators suggests pragmatists are trying to find a way out, but the IRGC track suggests the ideologues are tightening their grip. These two dynamics are not compatible in the long run. One of them will win, and which one wins will determine whether the backchannel between Mojtaba and Trump produces a historic deal or collapses into a wider and far more destructive escalation. And here we need to introduce a factor that almost nobody in the mainstream press is talking about seriously: Russia. Reports from Kuwait's Al Jarida news outlet, citing a senior source close to the new Iranian leader, claimed that Mojtaba Khamenei was smuggled out of Iran in a secretive Russian operation to receive medical treatment in Moscow for injuries sustained in the same airstrikes that killed his father. The report alleged that Russian President Vladimir Putin personally proposed bringing Khamenei to Russia for treatment. If this is true, and it remains unverified but has not been definitively denied, then the location of Iran's supreme leader is Moscow. And if the supreme leader is in Moscow, then Putin has leverage over this entire negotiation that no one is publicly acknowledging. Russia has a profound strategic interest in ensuring that Iran does not make a deal with the United States that normalizes the Islamic Republic within the American-led economic order. A rehabilitated Iran that reopens to American investment and drops its nuclear ambitions is an Iran that drifts away from Moscow's orbit. Putin understands this, and if Mojtaba Khamenei is currently a guest in a Russian hospital, the idea that Russia is not whispering in his ear about the terms of any potential deal is frankly naive. Then there is the China dimension, which is even more rarely discussed but equally important. China has been Iran's primary economic lifeline throughout the sanctions regime. Iranian oil has been flowing to China at discounted rates, providing Beijing with cheap energy and Tehran with a financial lifeline. Any deal between Iran and the United States that reopens Iran to global energy markets normalizes oil prices in a way that reduces China's advantage. Beijing has its own interest in the outcome of this negotiation, and while China is not publicly at the table in the same way Pakistan or Turkey are, its fingerprints are on the Iranian economy in ways that make it effectively a silent stakeholder in whatever deal ultimately emerges. Trump has hinted at something that would be genuinely extraordinary if it came to pass: a joint US-Iran arrangement overseeing the Strait of Hormuz once it is reopened to global shipping. Think about what that would mean in practice. The Strait of Hormuz handles roughly 20% of the world's oil supply. A joint American-Iranian oversight arrangement for that choke point would be a geopolitical revolution. It would mean that the United States and Iran had moved from active military conflict to cooperative control of the world's most strategically vital waterway in the space of weeks. It would redraw the entire map of Middle Eastern power arrangements. It would have enormous consequences for Saudi Arabia, for the Gulf states, for Israel, and for every economy on earth that depends on the free flow of energy through that narrow passage. Trump himself has said, "All I'm saying is, we are in the throes of a real possibility of making a deal." And with Trump, you always have to listen not just to what he says, but to the structure of his statements. He is a man who has spent his life negotiating real estate deals, casino bankruptcies, television contracts, and trade wars. He understands leverage. He understands the theater of negotiation. And when he says, "we are in the throes of a real possibility," in Trumpian language, that usually means something concrete is already on the table and he is managing the optics around the announcement. What we are watching, if you step all the way back and look at the full picture, is one of the most compressed and dramatic geopolitical transformations in recent history. In less than a month, the Islamic Republic of Iran has gone from a state led by a powerful supreme leader who had guided its ideology for decades to a state whose new supreme leader cannot be located, whose military is partially destroyed, whose navy has reportedly been surrendering vessels as part of preliminary negotiations, whose economy is under crushing pressure, and whose diplomatic corps is quietly telling American envoys in secret phone calls that the leader has given his blessing to end the war. Meanwhile, the United States is publicly claiming regime change has been achieved, while simultaneously trying to negotiate a deal with whoever is left standing in Tehran. And all of this is happening while Russia may be physically hosting the Iranian supreme leader in a Moscow medical facility, while China watches its economic leverage over Iran potentially evaporate, while Israel continues its own military campaign regardless of what Washington and Tehran are discussing, and while Pakistan, Turkey, and Egypt scramble to construct a diplomatic framework that can hold long enough for both sides to declare some version of victory. This is not a regional story. This is not an Iran story or a Trump story. This is a story about the reordering of global power and the secret channel between Mojtaba Khamenei and Donald Trump. Whether it produces a deal or collapses into nothing is the central thread of that reordering. The world you are living in is being reshaped right now, in conversations that are happening in places you cannot see, between people whose names Trump refuses to speak because speaking them might get them killed. That is the reality of what is unfolding. And the question you have to sit with, if you care about where this world is going, is a simple one. Who benefits when the smoke finally clears? Because in geopolitics, the answer to that question is never the one the headlines suggest.